There's something about darkness that evokes within us fear, anxiety, and gloom. Think about the child in his room at night, afraid of the dark. And the parent has to go in and comfort the child and turn on the light and assure the child that everything is going to be all right. It's the darkness. Book of Genesis opens in darkness. Because the writer says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. I went to a pharmacy the other day, pick up a prescription, which I find myself doing more often. And it was quite late in the afternoon, and the young woman who attended me gazed through the glass doors of the CVS, and she shook her head and remarked with some remorse, "It's dark already." Because it wasn't long ago when we enjoyed longer days with extended daylight. But now the darkness descends earlier and hovers over us like a brooding shadow. Scientific research has concluded that shorter days and long nights, coupled with the cold of winter, affect our behavior and our moods. And many people suffer during this time of the year from what psychologists call the wintertime blues. And danger often lurks in the darkness. The elderly are less inclined to go out in the dark. Driving is more challenging for so many in the dark. And in past generations, children were told by their parents that they could play outside during the daylight, but be home by the time the sun goes down. Be home before, right when the street light comes on. Be home before dark. Darkness has been the subject of essays and poems, says one writer. When the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness. One of the 10 plagues visited upon the Egyptians by Moses, among the plagues of rivers turning to blood and frogs and gnats and hail and locusts, was the plague of darkness, which covered the Egyptians for 3 days. 3 of the 4 Gospels agree that while Jesus was dying on the cross, darkness covered the earth for 3 hours. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places." There's something, would you agree with me, something about the darkness? In the 9th chapter of the prophecy of Isaiah, the ancient seer of Israel speaks of a dark time in the life of his people. Long gone were the glory days of Israel's fame and influence. Long gone was their great poet King David, who sat on the throne and elevated the kingdom to lofty peaks of prominence and power that it had never known before and would never know again. Darkness hung like a canopy over the land of Israel, because the prophet, as well as other biblical writers, uses darkness as a metaphor for depression and death. And so the darkness of which the prophet speaks has nothing to do with the time of day. It's not clock time darkness. It's not AM, PM darkness, but gloom. It's a time of despair, a time of sadness, a darkness of the soul. Tears are shed in the darkness. It was a time when people, then as now, had lost hope. A time when the land of Israel had been ravaged by war and destruction. A time when feared mighty Assyria had laid waste not only the land of the promise, but the hopes and dreams of a people. It was a time when even God seemed silent. Now, do you see any similarities between Isaiah's time and our time? Would you not agree that we too are living in times of darkness and gloom, in spite of Black Friday and Cyber Monday, in spite of Christmas sales, in spite of malls with decorations beckoning us to buy stuff we don't need? Would you agree with me that we're living in times of darkness and gloom when many have lost hope in a political system that's controlled by the rich and by the powerful, a political system where money not only buys votes, but it buys power. And it's interesting, if I may digress, that because the results of the election came out favorably for the person who won in comparison to 2020, Have you noticed there are no manufactured charges of voter fraud? Nobody's talking about a stolen election, no talk of wrongdoing, no plans to storm the Capitol, to cause a riot and call it a love fest, no going to court in order to prove that the election was rigged, not this time, because losers change their tune when they win. These are times, my brothers and my sisters, when hatred, racial hatred, has been emboldened, encouraged, and normalized. It's a time when the voters said it's all right to hate black folk. And just like Israel, we too are wondering, where is our God? We too are wondering what the future will look like when December has ended, when a new year has dawned. What's in store for us during these dark days? What about the darkness in our communities, where violence invokes fear and neighbors are not neighborly, neighbors are killing neighbors? What about the darkness that lurks in our schools, where learning is supposed to take place, but more often than not, our schools are battle zones, our children are unsafe, and our teachers teach in fear? What about the darkness in human relationships, when love goes awry, when relationships drown in mistrust and disappointment, when marriages turn toxic and relationships are marred by violence? We're living in a dark time. And what about families broken by old jealousies and pettiness? Talk to me, somebody. And the matriarchs and patriarchs who once kept the family together are no longer with us. Or the darkness in many churches struggling to stay alive and to stay open when religious institutions have fallen upon hard times. Or the darkness in our nation, a nation that has made a choice and now must live with the choices that have been made. But thank God. Thank God, because there's always reason to thank God. There's always reason to thank God, even in the midst of the darkness. Thank God that the prophet Isaiah does not allow us to linger long in the darkness. The prophet knows something. The prophet feels something in his bones. The prophet sees what his people cannot see, and knows what his people do not know, and discerns what his people cannot discern, and hears what his people cannot hear. Listen to him. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And on those living in the shadow of death, a light has dawned. While the prophet acknowledges the darkness, and while the prophet acknowledges the fact that the people are walking in darkness, he reports that there's good news. The good news is the darkness won't last. Amen. And you know, this is the first Sunday of the season called Advent, which calls us and beckons us to turn aside from the negativity, to turn aside from the chaos and from the cares of the world, to turn aside from toxic politics, turn aside from the daily, minute by minute news cycle. Turn off CNN, turn off Fox, turn off the noise of the culture and focus now on what God is about to do. Because God is saying to Israel and saying to us, I want to show you something that the world doesn't want you to see. I want to show you something that the culture does not want you to be a part of. I want to focus on what I am doing, because I, the Lord, will bring light out of darkness. And that in spite of what we've already been through, in spite of what we're going through, in spite of what we may go through in the days and years to come, God has spoken. The electorate has spoken. The majority of Americans have spoken, but somebody else has a word greater than that word. God has spoken. You see, because the God who has been silent has something to say. Even when God is inactive, God's working. God is moving, even when we don't see God moving. And the prophet wants us to know that darkness is not our destiny. And darkness is not the default setting in our lives. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. And what we have here is contrasting images. We have darkness and light. We have contrasting realities. In the field of photography, there's a technique called contrast. One of the reasons sometimes I like the old black and white movies. And, I mean, do y'all know what I'm saying? I know young people are saying, what's that? But some, the old black, because of the way that they were able to contrast the light and the darkness and the shadows. There was an art to black and white, a technique called contrast. In black and white, there's a contrast between the light and the shadows. Each one is distinct, different. Darkness is not light.
That's right.
And light is not darkness. Each is a different reality. Darkness can represent a dark place in your life. Have you ever been in a dark place? Don't say you have if you haven't, but if you have, say something. Have you ever been in a dark place? Have you ever been treated badly by someone you love? Have you ever been mistreated on a job where you worked hard and you were loyal? Have you ever been in a place of hopelessness? Talk to me, a place where you felt you were sucked into a pit and falling deeper and deeper. Have you ever felt you were on the edge of a precipice, dangling off a cliff? You were in a place where the sun refused to shine. You were in a dark place. You lost a career. You lost a good job. You lost a loved ones who cannot be replaced. The breakup of a once promising relationship. You're in a state of despair, broken dreams, broken promises. Those are dark, lonely places. I ask you again, have you ever been in a dark place? But you found out that the sun will shine after a while. Now, may not be when you want it to shine. He may not come when you want him, but he's always on time. Even when God is late according to your time, he's always on time. And if you hold out long enough, you will discover that the sun will shine after a while, that in the midst of your darkness, God will speak to your soul. And then to take this a step further, the prophet writes not in the future tense, but he uses the past participle. Look at me, right? Look at me. Look at me, look at me. The past participle. Not saw, but have seen. That's past participle. I did go to school, y'all, for a couple of days, a past participle. And all that means is God has already put in motion what we now see. Not saw, not will see, not might see, but have seen. In other words, it's already happening right now. Prophet wants us, he says, open your eyes. It's not just what God is gonna do. It's what God is already doing. Because God doesn't wait to do, God is already at work. And you know why? We are all the time busy asking God to do something, busy with the future, until we often fail to appreciate the past participle. What God is already doing. What God has done prepares us for what God will do, because we can count on what God will do because of what God, help me, has already done. Now let me break it down. God has already made a way. God has already delivered. God has already opened doors. God has already been a shelter in the time of a storm. God has already been a rock in a weary land. God's future is tied to God's past because God allows us to look at him in terms, I've already blessed you. You're looking for something I've already done. And part of that comes out of memory. You see, you got to let your memory. Now listen, sometimes I forget what I did yesterday. Sometimes I forget what I preached last Sunday. Sometimes I forget something. My wife said, did you do it? I said, no, I forgot to do it. But I just told you, but you still forgot. And I just told you, well, do it. And I say, I forgot what you told me to do. But when I think about the goodness of Jesus, when I remember what he's already done. Hey! And that's what Moses tells the Israelites. That's what God keeps telling the Israelites. Remember, stop grumbling about what you need. Stop grumbling about what you don't have. Stop grumbling about the problems in your life. Remember what I've already done for you. Remember, God has already carried you on eagle's wings. Remember, God has brought you across the Red Sea and into the desert. Remember that God has already fed you when you were hungry and provided water when you were thirsty. Remember that with a mighty hand, God has already destroyed your enemies and made your enemies your footstool. Remember. Anybody here got any memories? Come on, don't fool me this morning. You got memories of what the Lord has already done. And if you remember nothing else, he woke you up this morning and started you on your way. Now, the light, says the prophet, is already breaking in on those, and then he says, on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. What does the prophet mean by the phrase shadow of death?
Go ahead, sir, help us.
Shadow of death. On those living in the land of the shadow, didn't say the land of death, but the land of the shadow of death. And you know, that's a poetic phrase. I heard that someplace else. There's someplace, shadow of death, shadow. Yea, though I walk. I thought I heard it somewhere. I thought I was going to get some help from somebody. Yea, though I walk through the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And then I'm reading in Isaiah the same phrase, shadow of death. What they talking about? Shadow of death. See, shadow of death is a metaphor in the Bible for thick darkness, gloom. It refers to when shepherds had to lead their sheep in order to find green pastures. Come on, stay with me. And they had to lead their sheep through something called ravines. And ravines were these small, narrow steep-sided valleys where you could easily fall off and kill yourself. But in order to get to the green pastures, the shepherd had to lead the sheep through the shadow of death. Ain't nobody shouting yet? That sometimes God has to lead you through dark places in order to get you to green pastures. Don't complain about your dark places. Don't get mad at God when you go through your dark places. Don't give up and stop going to church. Just say, I got to go through this because God is leading me, and the only way I can get to green pastures is to go through the shadow of death. Hey, 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 hey. And I say to you, my brothers and my sisters, there's reason to celebrate. I said there's reason to celebrate. In the midst of your dark places, in the midst of your calamities, in the midst of your trouble, there's reason to rejoice. Even in the midst of your sorrow, because of what God has already done, means that the future is brighter than the past. I said the future is brighter than the past, because the prophet said, here is the good news. The good news is, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. But I want you to know who the real light is. The light is Jesus. And the light shineth in darkness, but the darkness comprehended it not. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. I wonder today, do you understand that Jesus is the light? Even in the midst of your darkness, trials dark on every hand, and we cannot understand all the ways that God will lead us to that blessed promised land, but he'll guide us with his eye, and we'll follow till we die, and we'll understand it better by and by, when the morning comes, all the saints of God will be gathered home. We will tell the story of how we've overcome. We'll understand it better. We'll understand it better. We'll understand it better by and by, by and by, by and by, by and by, by and by. And the good news is, what I don't know now, I'll understand it better. Don't understand trouble now. Don't understand why I got to cry sometimes. Don't understand why the devil won't leave me alone. But by and by,